On this episode of the show, I have with me Michael Corr. He is founder and CEO of Duro, and we're going to be talking about being a founder and, well, not having a linear path to follow. And we're going to ask Michael what that means. We're going to talk to him about how he kept a cheat sheet of notes and how he journaled ideas along the way and how Duro started. And obviously within the space he's in, and he'll tell us obviously a little bit about that space. It's a lot of innovation, a lot of things happening quickly, and you have to adjust as a CEO and talk to him a little bit about that and maybe a couple other things if we can fit it all in. Michael, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, why don't you tell everyone what you guys do at Duro before we start?
Yeah, at a high level, Duro is a product lifecycle management product, PLM, and we help hardware design teams manage and produce their products through centralizing their CAD files, bill materials, supply chain information, really create that central source of truth across all the different teams it takes to design and manufacture hardware products. And we take a slightly different approach to a lot of legacy products in, first off, that we're cloud native, AI native, and really implement agile workflows, the principle of keeping it automated and simple for fast iterations, really helping companies iterate and manage their changes in a much faster pace than they had been able to previously.
Awesome. All right. So this topic, and I think I'm excited to cover this, is obviously talking to you about that non-linear path. You said something, and I wrote it down because I wanted to ask you about it. You said, if I was king one day, this is how I'd do it. And I love that because I think at some level, every founder wants to be able to have that opportunity to do things their way. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, just a quick background. My background is in electrical engineering, which I studied and worked in the industry for close to 20 years, working on various products like telecom equipment, IoT devices, wearables, robotics, drones, industrial equipment, you name it. Worked predominantly in San Francisco and the Bay Area. I actually lived in Hong Kong for a few years, working in the factories in Shenzhen. And throughout my career, the various companies I worked with, I used a handful of the available commercial products for managing bill materials and supply chain. And after having worked with enough companies and going through enough iterations in manufacturing and seeing the whole soup to nuts process and where all the risks were, and certainly having my own, manufacturing mistakes and production errors, really rooting it into a lot of how these legacy software products were built and their premise of how much manual steps it took to update, validate, and disseminate all that content across the different teams. And I was increasingly frustrated because I found that a lot of the production mistakes or delays were really rooted in just simple human error, logistical accounting issues of incorrect information, the wrong revisions being sent, inconsistent data across different users. And, a contract manufacturer, in the most common model of a hardware team, you have the design team is not the same as the manufacturing team. And often it's a completely separate entity, often in Asia. And so it's absolutely critical that the documentation of how to manufacture and procure your product is very clear and consistent, right? Putting yourself in the shoes of a contract manufacturer. Certainly the low volume, high mix manufacturers, they're switching between accounts, every week. And they have to be able to quickly review your documentation and make sense of it and understand what they need to procure and how they need to assemble it. And any mistakes in that information, any complexities or ambiguity really opens up the door to risk, right? And either a good manufacturer will stop the presses and ask you those questions. Hey, this is not clear. This is inconsistent. What would you like us to do? But some manufacturers just kind of go with it, right? And you kind of cross your fingers to see what happens on the other end. And hardware manufacturing is not a cheap endeavor to make mistakes on, right? A lot of capital, costs in procuring the parts and certainly the time lost for manufacturing. We're talking weeks or months. Anyway, going back to what we said earlier, so I recognize how risky this endeavor was, and it was rooted in the data management, in my opinion. And that, in conjunction with, in the mid 2000s, during my career, I saw the huge uptick in innovation in the software tool industry. My peers at my company on the software teams were getting amazing new technologies, new APIs, new capabilities almost daily. And what now has become, commoditized in the cloud and agile workflows, and recognizing that, hey, the hardware industry could benefit from these same innovations as well, certainly with the data management and the interoperability between the bespoke products. And so that's when I started thinking like, hey, if I were king for a day, if I were to build my own PLM product, here's how I would do it. And that was really the innovation, finding that problem and then seeing this technological, capabilities to solve it. How would I bridge the two?
Very cool. I love the backstory and kind of obviously how the mindset has evolved, and you are now actually king of Duro, which is nice. You get to do those things yourself. And I do hear a lot, and we've heard a lot about people keeping track of ideas. I've had a number of founders who have mentioned that. We've heard about founders that have already exited that talk about their habits of journaling. We hear a lot about it. I guess for you, you mentioned that you kind of kept track of notes. You did do that as well. And I sometimes, I haven't really had a chance to dive in and ask, but I sometimes think it's really interesting for people to hear what you did, what you journal, because sometimes people hear about it and they jump out, go buy a journal. They're like, I'm going to keep track of my ideas. And then they stick to it for all about 3.5 days, and they have this Moleskine or similar journal that's now sitting on the side of their desk and not doing anything. But when it comes to journaling, keeping track of your ideas, tell us a little bit about why you did it, how you did it, and actually how it maybe helped you here.
Yeah, so I used a note-taking tool that I was attracted to. I know there's dozens of different types, and people have their own personal processes for keeping track of tasks. There's a particular tool that I liked. It had a desktop version, a mobile version, a cloud version. And so it allowed me to work offline and keep things in sync pretty easily. And it just made it, because of its accessibility, like anytime an idea came up, it's very easy for me to jot it down. And even, small things like adding simple features, how would I make this process simpler, using the legacy products, how would I do that? Or opportunities, if there are other products, as they say, it takes a village to build a hardware product. There's no single products that you can use to manage everything across the entire food chain of designing, manufacturing hardware product. And so there are many other founders who are also doing some fantastic stuff and contributing to the larger industry. And so ideas I had for integrating with them or how to leverage their technologies, really just kind of staying on top of it and adamant about making sure it was easily available for me to quickly jot down those notes. And then, when I finally found the opportunity to start Duro, I did constantly refer back to that journal entry, the hundreds of little bespoke comments and notes and feature ideas. And, it became the first version of Duro was really from that note and all the features that I was thinking of.
Very cool. And out of curiosity, do you keep up with it to this day? Is it something that you still maintain?
In a different way, it evolves. I mean, now that we have a full company, and product managers and engineers, and we use other, task management tools, I don't keep that particular note up to date as much anymore. But every once in a while, I find myself going back to it and being like, how, just as my personal journey, like how much was I true to that vision and how much have we deviated from it?
Very cool. Very cool. I guess, when we're looking at your background, you kind of alluded to a little bit of this. And, when you do want to start a business and you see a gap, obviously you mentioned, innovation. When you do enter the market and you start off with a potential idea, and obviously that idea evolves, can you look back and compare your original intent to now and kind of let us know what has anything changed? Has something evolved? Have you stuck to it pretty much as you thought?
I'll say definitively it has changed, right? You have to, without a doubt, right? But I'll say the core focus we have stayed true to, right? So the core focus, the core motivation for starting Duro honestly was to help the larger hardware community. As I referenced, the software industry had an amazing boon in innovation capabilities, and I feel really leapfrogged ahead in terms of efficiency that compared to the hardware industry. And I was for a while just seeing just so many, young hardware companies making the same mistakes and really impacting their chances of hitting production on time and on budget. And so the original motivation for starting Duro was not just to solve my own problems, but really to help the larger community. I felt there was so much tribal knowledge that was learned empirically in the field, in the factories, having built products that wasn't being disseminated to the larger community in an easy way. And I felt through software there was a way to implement industry best practices and help guide younger teams on how to stay true and avoid the common pitfalls and minefields that I was seeing many hardware companies fall into. And so that has always been true. That's the main goal for Duro, is how do we help the larger hardware community be successful, right? As I mentioned, hardware is a very, very expensive endeavor. And the more mistakes you make, the more expensive it can be. There's that saying, hardware is hard, which I don't really agree with. Any product category can have its difficulties, but what has always made hardware so risky and quote difficult is really just the processes themselves have never really been that efficient. And so it's required this layers of complexity of, employment of staffing and processes just to double, triple check the data as it goes to production to try and avoid these expensive manufacturing issues. And I feel a lot of that can and should be solved with software. And so that fundamental has always stayed true. The features that we implement, the market we go after, that has certainly evolved as our own requirements evolved, as investors' requirements evolved, as the market has evolved. That I think is very paramount for any founder is you still have to be able to adapt to the environment as it changes. And in a very good way, the hardware industry is rapidly evolving at a much faster pace now than I've ever seen it in my 20 plus year career, in a good way. And so that too has caused Duro to try and stay up to date with the culture, with the expectations and the way that people are designing manufacturing products today. It's not the same, certainly 10, 15 years ago, but even 5, 6 years ago, it's definitely evolved.
Interesting. When you mentioned, obviously, hardware has evolved. It's never gotten more attention than it is. I mean, maybe in the early days, right? I think the early days, obviously, the fascination with hardware. Now we're understanding the impact and the parallel track of software and hardware. I guess for you, when you're looking at keeping up in a rapidly changing environment, potentially, how do you manage that? And I don't know if, maybe it's a roadmap question, maybe it's a understanding of paying attention to competitors or the general market, but I do find it interesting that every startup seemingly has to pay attention at a faster cycle rate than maybe 5, 6 years ago when AI wasn't a discussion. Are you seeing that, or are you potentially immune from that, or what are you seeing?
No, definitely seeing that. I think the hardware economy was growing and evolving and innovating already at a much faster pace. And then when AI became mature and was more prevalent and available to assist that, I think it picked up even faster. And so we have to really stay on top of it to the best we can, predict where it's going to go, because our own development cycles, we can't always be playing catch up. Like, we have to leapfrog ahead of where the market is today and try and be ahead of it. So by the time our own features and product has evolved, the market kind of meets us at that point.
And when it comes to, I guess, being the CEO and making sure that you're seeing the right adjustments, but obviously the team necessarily doesn't need to always be privy to the noise. I mean, there's a level of balance between informing, insulation, that delicate balance. How do you decide what gets filtered down? Because obviously, I'm sure you have a ton of ideas. And obviously, you have a product team as well, and you must see the bigger picture that you're also working towards. But some of the noise that's out there does get distracting for the rest of the team.
That's a great question. I'll say it's difficult. I think as a software company, I mean, one of the benefits you have is being able to adapt and evolve quickly, right? Software is obviously more malleable with agile workflows. One could design and release features at a very fast pace. But you also have to make sure you don't become that decapitated chicken where you're just running left and right, following every single shiny object or opportunity, because you'll squash the productivity of your development team and your marketing team and sales team, because they won't be able to keep up. They won't be able to see that linear path or that continuous story arc about what you're doing, so they can be successful, right? They'll get burnt out. The context switching can be, very dangerous. And so it's right. It is difficult, right? Certainly as you identify new customer opportunities or new market opportunities, like every founder, every salesperson has the same predicament. You've got some enticing customer who's waving a check, like, we'll give you this check if you give us this feature. And you have to, hopefully the feature is already on your roadmap. Maybe you have to expedite it, or maybe you can evolve that feature request into something that can be more commoditized across your other customers. But, every once in a while, you have to do some soul searching, be like, is this something that we really need to add to the product? Does it actually move our company and product and position forward? Or is it just a bespoke distraction right now? Because sometimes, and I'll admit, I've been guilty of that as well. And sometimes it's with good judgment. You think this feature and this customer are going to open up more doors, and they don't. But it's no harm, no foul. It was done in good judgment and review. Sometimes it is done a little hasty, and maybe in hindsight, it was a bad decision to go after that feature, that customer.
I have to admit that's a question I think I should start asking most of my founders who come on, because I think it's one of the hardest things. Actually, any leader, founder has CEO has a little bit more even a pressure, because the entire organization's direction is there. But I think that may be.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, and certainly as a venture-backed company, you're not the master of your domain, and you do have to meet investor expectations or the larger VC community expectations to be able to, go after the subsequent funding rounds. There's certain KPIs and certain metrics that they're looking for. And in order to hit them, sometimes you have to make consolations from your original vision or your original product roadmap to make sure that you can hit those numbers. And those can be very, very difficult decisions to make.
Absolutely. I guess, maybe final question would be around when you're looking at the pace at which things are evolving, and you are potentially looking at investors, and you are looking at your internal company, and you're obviously having to have those discussions of where you see the company, 3, 5, 10 years out. With the pace of innovation that's happening, what's the right question here? How firm can you be? Because obviously I know your goal. Your goal sounds very clear. Like I know the mission. And I do hear founders who are like, I know what the North Star is and we work towards that. But also what we can't know, and this might be different than most phases of software development before, because there was an iteration and there was a pace at which we knew things were supposed to be delivered and developed. That has kind of changed the expectations. Is there a way you view that in terms of how you align, what you have to communicate to the company, to investors, your roadmap, and how far you're confident in looking?
Yeah. I mean, I think right now we're going through some major and exciting platform updates, really embedding AI capabilities, embedding more API driven functionality. And it's as a response to both our customers' requests, as where I'm seeing the trends in the market itself. But when you're moving this fast in an industry that I think is evolving even faster, while we do have, 5 and 10 year North Stars, I think really all we can focus on is like the next 12 to 18 months. Because honestly, everything else beyond that is just complete speculation. We have no idea where manufacturing is going to go, how hardware teams are going to continue to design their products. AI, like with Gen AI capabilities getting better and better, are people going to use traditional CAD tools anymore? Are they even going to have, desktop based file structures anymore, which has been how CAD files have been managed in the past? Supply chain, content we're seeing being more and more tightly integrated with PLM and in the design cycles, and more digitally accessible. And so how is that going to evolve the way that engineers do their design cycles? Manufacturing, we're seeing coming more and more in-house than I've seen in the past. And so OEMs or hardware companies are procuring their own manufacturing capabilities. And so how does that evolve when it is the same design and manufacturing team in one house, not as consistent with the legacy model? What's going to be the demands on data management then? And so, again, in a good way, I think we're positioning ourselves to be able to be adaptable, and making our platform very extendable and configurable to be able to evolve as these, customer needs change, as well as other products enter the market to which we want to integrate with. And so right now, I think that's the best bet to place is how do we make sure that we don't paint ourselves into a corner and become obsolete?
I love that. Great answer. Will be definitely interesting to see how things evolve. Obviously, the pace of change is high, and I have to have you back on and talk to us about how things look, 12, 18, 24 months out. Michael, if somebody does want to follow up with you, ask you something that they, thought about, a question I didn't ask, is there a good way of connecting with you to do that?
Yeah, the best way certainly is go to our website, getduro.com. You can start there. There's tons of information, obviously links to contact us, myself, or our sales team. But you can always find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to respond, to messages there or requests.
Okay. All right. Hopefully people will direct to those resources. And again, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you, Amir.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, obviously, Michael came on, talked to us a little bit about, a founder's path is not linear. And actually, we learned quite well that is the case. And he actually dove in and talked to us a little bit about, how he viewed becoming a founder and CEO and things he wanted to do if he had the opportunity. And obviously, he's dealing with an industry that lacked innovation. And he is now, thick things, and he is dealing with that. And we talked about the innovation and pace of change. We talked about how he views his role as CEO and founder and kind of navigating some of that noise and what he, manages in communication with his team and other founders and investors as well. Please share this episode with others. I do think Michael did a great job of being as candid as possible and answering every question I threw at him. So I really appreciate his time, and it'd be great if you guys share this episode. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.